Hello, everyone. My name is Masaya Llavaneras Blanco, and I am part of the Executive Committee of DAWN. Today, I'm very excited to be with Netzanet Gebre-Mikael and Sue Gott as part of DAWN's project analyzing public-private partnerships in the Global South from a feminist perspective. This project, which has been ongoing for the past few years, is also part of our work on the corporate capture of development in the Global South and what this entails. Today, we will be in conversation with Netzanet Gebre-Mikael, who is currently Fatima Mernissi postdoctoral fellow in the Africa Institute in Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates. She is a researcher and assistant professor at the Institute of Ethiopian Studies in Addis. Netzanet is also part of the authors that worked with us in producing grounded research on the way public-private partnerships have been unfolding in the Global South. Sue Gott is also going to be in conversation with us. She's a retired development worker who has lived and worked across sub-Saharan Africa for over 30 years. And she's completing her doctorate at the University of Bath in the UK with a focus on the growing role of global corporations in providing basic health and education services in Kenya and Uganda. Sue is also a friend of Dawn who has been supporting our work on this issue in the region. Before we get into the subject of public-private partnerships in Ethiopia, we also want to know about your own trajectory, Netzanet. We would love to learn about your own trajectory as an Ethiopian feminist, what brought you into feminism, and what does feminism add to our own understanding of Ethiopia development and the current context in the country.
Thank you so much, Masaya, for the conversation today. Just by way of engaging with your question, I mobilize it from literatures, from social movements, from ways of acting and being in the world. And I think what feminism is to me is a discomfort with social, political, and economic injustices, which we experience and notice in local contexts. So I would call one of the lenses through which I engage in form of thinking and acting and noticing is through feminism, which has a local manifestation and history of its own, of women's struggles, but also social movements, social struggles, which said no or kind of pushed back into structural manifestations of injustices, be it social, political, and economic. So I call myself a feminist as inhabiting that discomfort at home in Ethiopia, and then joining other sisters and brothers who also have similar struggles elsewhere at the regional, continental, African, and also global level. But I think its local manifestation is very important in the way in which multiple social movements have foregrounded women and women's questions. And that is the local historical context through which I embrace feminism. To me, it's through these layers of discomforts at a local, regional, and global level that I call myself feminists, not only against structures at B, but with and against different formulations of feminism, which we kind of co-deliberate and critically engage each other to expand the level of discomfort, but also react to that discomfort. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Netzanet, for your really profound reflections. And I think especially when you referred to the importance of location, place, context, and social movements. So I'd like right now to maybe explore a little bit more about the context of Ethiopia. Your case study has shown that as the government started to reform its economic policies, the international financial institutions, or IFIs, made every effort to convince the government to adopt the dominant liberalization strategies, including privatization and public-private partnerships. And they praised Ethiopia for its achievements under what they called the unorthodox development state model. But they also emphasized that the model had served its purpose and it was now time to further open the economy. This is something that we know that the International Monetary Fund has done in the past, so it's not a new story for Ethiopia. But as the government launched its reform programs, the IMF, the World Bank, and many donor countries provided huge loans to finance the economic reforms. And yet now, in 2021, 2022, Ethiopia, along with most countries in sub-Saharan Africa, face great difficulties in repaying these loans. The IFIs, however, are responding very harshly to Ethiopia by refusing to negotiate additional funding and by delaying debt renegotiations. So as an outsider, it seems as if Ethiopia has gone from being almost courted as a darling of the development world to being punished and bullied by these same international financial institutions. Is this how it's being perceived nationally, would you say?
Thank you for that insightful reflection and question, Sue. The way I understand it, at least in the current affairs of things, perhaps we need more evidence on how that shift came about. And there is lack of transparency on policy matters. And that lack of transparency don't give us access to why this shift came about. Although there are internal contradictions, as you know, currently in Ethiopia, the post-2018 reform process, which also entails reform for economic, political, and other realm of life, kind of heralded a very optimistic start, particularly with the economic liberalization process. And that was argued because of the existing economic situation, which was interestingly narrated in paradoxical terms. One, that the Ethiopian state under the developmental state did well. Its paradoxical narrative is that it needs to move into liberalization. The local discussions, at least from what I have seen, is that shift was justified because of corruption, embezzlement of public properties, inability or inefficiency of state-owned enterprises, and then the necessity for the private sector to play a central role. So there is sort of a reformulation which was happening at the state level in terms of its economic policy, which was later formulated as homegrown economic reform. So all of this has very multiple stories, which are not freely accessed as much as I know. Those which are pronounced in form of policy gives us a promissory notes on how wealth is to be created, how jobs are going to be created, how private sector is going to take the lead, but how all of this economic reform is homegrown. On the other hand, 2018, this reform was also necessitated by protest movements. And the archives or the data we have from this protest movements is wealth distribution is not enough. There is land dispossession, there is lack of jobs and all of that, but also about political participation of certain ethnic groups, minorities, and the like. So that culminated into a faction within the deep state, which now seem to be illustrated in form of war or conflict. And that conflict is being mobilized. The public is mobilized for and against the conflict. The state has its own narrative of why this conflict came about. And the faction which is created from the state, which is involved in the conflict, also has its narrative. And these competing narratives are formulated by the mobilized public, building on to memories of the 2018 protests, which is that we protested for politics to open up, for a better state, for public participation. But also all of this conflict is related or narrated in form of ethnic or national sentiment. So the way we see it now is not targeting the IMF or how the IMF is engaging the Ethiopian state and its economic reforms and the vulnerability of the Ethiopian state in responding to that structural imposition. The manifestation, as I said, are not put into protest by putting the political economic juncture together. More, the manifestations comes as a resistance against the United States and EU or other Western countries which are intervening in Ethiopian internal affairs, and we want their hands off. So if you've heard, the No More movement is like, we don't want you to intervene. We don't want to intervene into our local affairs. Unfortunately, that political defiance or sort of resistance, the way I see it, has not taken the economic vulnerability aspect along with it. So it's very hard for me to see the way Ethiopian state is made more vulnerable under the International Financial Organization, which were really pushing forward and really making most of the policy consultations for Ethiopia to move into privatization and liberalization and praising post-2018 Ethiopian state. But suddenly, under the guise of the humanitarian crisis, they seem to shift the narrative and also making the terms of politics beyond the economic conversations and contestations, using the political arena to change the political economic conditions. So that analysis is not yet there as a site of protest locally, meaning the analysis of political economic situation and vulnerability together. I think the political vulnerability is very much pronounced, and it has been protested both in the diaspora and at home. But the economic vulnerability is not so much popularized, and maybe I have missed it, but I haven't seen a very dominant voice against IMF or World Bank in the way in which the political economic vulnerability is being mobilized into describing or giving loans or not giving loans through engaging with the current crisis in the conflict.
One almost gets a sense that all these reforms economically are happening almost, below the radar, because all the attention is focused on the political discourse at the moment. And I think what we'd like to do is maybe just look a little more closely at the economic processes and reforms that are underway so that we can better understand, maybe what some of those pressures are that even if they're not really emerging across the general discourse at the present time, especially around the public-private partnership or PPP strategies that Ethiopia has adopted. We know, and I think you were mentioning that as well, that initially the government didn't plan to fully privatize all the sectors in the economy. It adopted what it called a more pragmatist model rather than a full privatization agenda. Because what it really wanted to do was to work with the private sector to generate revenues that it could then use to finance other infrastructure and other development in the country. Critics did caution against this wholesale adoption of PPPs before really investigating alternatives. And there were concerns mentioned that allowing foreign forces to control most of the public enterprises could erode national independence. And I was really struck because most African countries have also implemented PPP strategies and projects, and they face the same tensions as in Ethiopia, and concerns have been raised at both national and continental levels. So, for example, in 2019, the UN Economic Commission for Africa, or UNECA's Macroeconomics and Governance Division, it highlighted the fiscal risks linked to PPPs. And it pointed out that the biggest risk was the government guarantee risk, whereby governments are committed to paying PPP loans, fees, and returns in foreign exchange rather than local currency. And this makes it very difficult for countries to budget, given the wildly fluctuating exchange rates. The division also stressed that fiscal risks are also a political issue. And the senior special assistant on infrastructure to the president of Nigeria actually urged for more work to be done on the political economy of implementing PPPs. And yet, despite these concerns that were raised in 2019, and only 1 year later in 2020, UNECA and the African Development Bank were prioritizing PPPs as a key strategy to rebuild African economies in the light of COVID-19. So it's clear that PPPs are still a dominant strategy and remain highly contested in the region. And I think maybe with that kind of more general background, I'll hand over to you, Messiah, to talk more specifically about the case study now. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue, and thank you, Netzanet, for this conversation. In your paper, Netzanet, which it's entitled PPPs Meet the Developmental State, the Case of Ethiopia, you used a phrase that stuck with me as a very clear way of understanding the importance of PPPs as a model in the process of economic reforms and its political implications. And you said PPPs are the model and the language of the liberalization process in Ethiopia. And I repeat for clarity. You said PPPs are the model and the language of the liberalization process in Ethiopia. And I found that phrase to be very powerful in indicating the relevance of understanding how a model of development finance shapes a larger process of reform and how both are very deeply integrated. Your case focused on the privatization of the electricity system in particular. The Ethiopian electric power was to be restructured to reduce its debt and expand services to unserved communities. That's the story with which, or the narrative with which, the public-private partnership model has been pushed in Ethiopia. However, one of the interesting aspects of the Ethiopian case is that it remains, to a certain degree, the last frontier in the process of PPP implementation. So it begs the question, why was the national electrification program switched into this model? And how was the political process through which this transformation happened? And what was the role of society at large in this process as well?
So, like Sue pointed out, there are contestations by the way in which PPPs are being implemented in the continent. And what this paper tried to do was to read major news outlets of the country where I have found stories of PPP. And mostly these were English-based newspaper, and those are the business newspaper usually in Ethiopia. So in those news outlets and other government documents, it's argued that PPP is a framework through which financing infrastructure is going to happen from 2018 on. And the justification given is one situation analysis, which is analyzing the state of the economy. They point out problems like debts, particularly state-owned organizations like the electric power, for example, the case that we closely read. They have debts. They are not able to pay their loans. And 70% of the Ethiopian population still needs access to electricity. And that need needs to be met by new infrastructural financing and development. And that new capital, which is to develop the infrastructure for the Ethiopian electric power, is to come from the private sector. And that is tied to the broader argument about the private sector playing the central role, and that in previous eras, pre-2018, Ethiopia has never been very friendly for the private sector, both for the local and foreign private sector. And now the new formulation within that economic liberalization is to open up the system for foreign and local private sector to play central role, although in the rhetoric, it emphasizes it's the private sector which will be given the primacy in taking ahead or financing infrastructure development. So it was both a new start, but also a new start which kind of built on a reflection. And the reflection is one of a grim situation, which is debt. Most of these state-owned organizations are unable to pay their loans, and they have a huge amount of debt. And there is a lot of inefficiency. The amount of debt they accumulated, let alone to invest further for the needs of future generation and the current generation. We cannot even pay the debts which they have accumulated. And hence, for the new process of infrastructural development to happen, we need a capital which has to be mobilized from the private sector by offering the private sector a central role to play, both local and international private sector. So this is the argument through which PPP was being justified and is still being justified to play central role in the liberalization process in Ethiopia. Probably we can build on what are the contradictory elements of this justification. But I think what this justification misses out is what Sue has brought in earlier on, the existing debate, which I think agree with you, Masaya, that Ethiopia is almost on the last frontier and hence would offer a more critical reflection so that we know not only the economic limitations of all of these promises, we also have to look into the historical unfolding of PPP in different contexts, particularly in developing countries, particularly in the continent. And Ethiopia could build on all of those knowledge which has come about to better negotiate into entering into PPP beyond its political implication. The other side is the political implication of inviting the private sector to have all of this role and shifting the role of the state into a regulatory state, particularly in the political economic realm, would of course transform the role of society to become more of a space of market extraction than a voice of negotiation, a voice with interest, economic and political interest, in the way in which one would define how to use their natural resources or public enterprises. So these discussions were lacking. And I don't think the way PPP is going to impact people's household level life in reorganizing it, that's not how it's popularly engaged. And I don't think PPP is very famously engaged along different layers of society. And that already has a consequences in the way in which one is paying attention to one side of the debate without counting on to the other side of the critical element of PPP and historical reflections on examples or experiments which have been done so far. And if that is being done, perhaps it needs to be publicly deliberated, debated among the Ethiopian public with the language they know, so that they also have a say in this policy shift.
So from listening to you, Netzanet, we see that there is a history behind the implementation of the public-private partnership model linked to the structural shifts taking place in the Ethiopian model of developmental state, the implementation of the economic reforms that have come, among others, with the vocabulary of the public-private partnerships in Ethiopia has gone at a very, very, very fast pace, to the point that it's really hard to believe in how short time Ethiopia has transitioned from being a desired, coveted spot for IFIs to the current state in which there are no forecasts about the future of the economy. The vulnerabilities that we see globally also have expressions at the local level. And one of the things that I would love to go back from your work, Netzanet, is the role of households and how everyday life at the household level is experienced or is shifting in the context of these economic reforms and general political context. This makes me think, for example, about your critiques about discussions around gender mainstreaming and how that language and that vocabulary is often associated with progress in the framework of PPPs and economic reforms. How has gender been played out in these processes?
I think worth reflecting on how the global structures of reconfiguring political economic life at the state impacts every level of social and political economic relationships. There has been a delinking between the economic formulations of lives and the political formulations of life. And by the time those two meet, they meet at the local front. And it makes the current state or whichever state more vulnerable, because accountability in form of protest, for instance, would reach local state. It does not reach the IFIs or it does not reach the private sector. So when all of this crisis is happening and loans are not being offered or the promised ones are withheld and indebtedness is going up, and like Sue was saying earlier on, the transaction is going to happen with foreign exchange. All of this economic pressures on the state also comes from the IFIs and the private sector, which are already involved in those promissory moments of transition, but is caught up in the internal contradiction in the political struggles, which is trying to reformulate a new state and political community. And during this conflict, as this pressure mounts up, of course, it enters to the private realm, it enters to communities, to society, because the way the state administers its population is through loan systems, through infrastructural development, by employing the youth or unemployed into the development projects, which are financed either from private or even through aid organization, but now shifting into the private, and hence those job creation processes and promises are now withheld. So this is a huge amount of pressure on the national state, but also huge amount of existential problem for the local and more so for underprivileged classes and gender identities. For example, if you notice the gender element of the electric power, women would need power or energy even just to go by their daily activities within the household. That energy intervention is important. But that energy is already in negotiation. The loans are not yet, the employees are not yet employed. And hence, gradually, the services might not even be there. And that means directly impacts the lives of women. And hence, I think we need to have a very not so comfortable conversation about gender mainstreaming or discussions of political participations of women at the highest level. So one of the ways in which the new political liberalization was really celebrated in Ethiopia in 2018 was that it elected its first female president. It elected its first judiciary. The head of the judiciary is the first female. And then you have 50-50% parity, which they call it as gender cabinet or females representation in the cabinet. And this was seen as a political liberalization. But that political liberalization, as I understand it, reflecting back to the questions which I was trying to point at, all of this political economic restructuring, which is happening in the midst of a conflict, which has a huge amount of pressure on the local national state, which would have obvious political, economic, social transformation on communities in general and vulnerable communities, more so on women. The lives which are being affected through this policy changes are not co-theorized with the celebratory elements of gender presence in the highest political spaces. So that should not hide the theorization or the formulation analysis of the conditionalities of women in their everyday life, how all this structural pressure is also mounting in their lives. So I think there are two layers of accountability to this. One is, like Sue was really emphasizing earlier on, to really put in place voices or spaces of accountability, debates and deliberations about this political economic shifts and its consequences to the public, which could be very much useful for the state to capitalize, to make its negotiations with the powers that be like the IMFs or the IFIs and the private sector in negotiation with the interests of its public or constituency, one. And the second is to make not only the celebratory voices of women who are in the highest official status, but those who are using that as an instrument of political liberalization need to be summoned and counter-argued about the practical policy implications that those women are to be put, especially facing this economic vulnerabilities. I'm not saying those celebrations or significances are to be undermined, but it should not be the only face. It should be co-deliberated with the vulnerabilities in which the moment, the context is also mounting. At least in the rhetoric, if women are being put 50-50 gender cabinet on the name of the populations of women or under the name of a political representation of women, and thus we need to ask those women as to how they are negotiating on behalf of all of these vulnerable women who are facing the structural transformation as it unfolds in their household. I think it will be very useful for the state as well to embrace a very conscious community so that those people whom we celebrate also become sites of struggle and opening up more space, more negotiation, not only within the local state, but also beyond the local state to make a case for those vulnerable communities which will be affected by the new political economic order, which is to come about through PPP.
So within these fractures, especially around the delinking of the economic and political processes and the separation of everyday people from the economic debates, beyond what you've been mentioning, how else can we understand resistance in the Ethiopian context?
I think this is very key, so thank you for pointing it out. And this is where I think there is a huge potential. If the state and its experts and consultants are very clear about creating a national sentiment around political economic life, what we have, what we don't have. You have to go back to the basic classical political economic question. what we have, what we don't have, what are the terms of engagement we're facing. All of this nationalism that is flourishing in the continent, and particularly also in Ethiopia, needs to have a political economic lens really at the forefront. I'm not saying the other political nationalism is not important. I say it is important. We are going through our own processes, and it's part of a political process. A nation can go into democratization, but that space for political economy to also be central in making those national conversations is very important. And for that to happen, the macro level conversations, the macro level constraints of the state need to be at least through key terms available to the public so that the public would know and deliberate about which way we go. I think one of the reflections after 2018 reform was to make democratization central, making the state accountable. This is what I mean. This is the promise of the state. For going in post-2018, one of the aspirations of the deep state was actually to be more democratized. And one of the ways in which we can democratize is for the public to access all of this information, to at least know what PPP is, how it's going to affect it. So the state kind of has to remind its own classical responsibility, not only to cater for the good of its citizens, but also to at least communicate the constraints of its operation within the constraints of global political economic order, whereby it then gives us more power, more collaborations from all these actors. It would give us a tool of solidarity by keeping the interest of the most vulnerable, including women, at the forefront.
Thank you so much, Netzanet, for sharing your passion and your reflections with us. We are learning a lot with you and learning a lot with the case of Ethiopia, not only about public-private partnerships, but also about the place of the political in these economic reforms, which is a place that is often invisibilized and forgotten. Thank you very much to Sue for joining us in this conversation, for adding so much insight and continental understanding of the weight of these transformations and these reform processes in Ethiopia, but also in Africa more generally. Thank you both for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom with Dawn. This podcast series was produced by Dawn, Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era. Today's episode was edited by Alice Furtado and engineered by Ernesto Sena. Thank you for joining us. If you would like to learn more about Dawn's work on public-private partnerships, visit our website at www.dawnnet.org. I am Masaya Llavaneras Blanco. See you on the next episode.